We started with these two images here. So you've got the Prime Minister David Cameron and his deputy Nick Clegg, and then towards the middle that's like a merging of the two. So what we were looking at the manifesto of the Liberal Democrat Party for the 2010 general election, the Conservative manifesto, and then seeing where decision making, agenda setting and preference shaping played a role in that. And we concluded that the Conservative Party used preference shaping most effectively from the three phases of power to shape the preferences of the Liberal Democrat Party, and therefore leading into UK government policy. Okay.
I'll just add, I suppose, of this group work, so that makes it a bit more interesting than just sitting at a laptop doing it by yourself. And obviously it's a poster, so you have to think about the visual aspects as well as what you're writing. I think what we found most difficult was trying to get the balance between text and obviously how big and readable the text was and the layout of the poster. So you have to be aware of both kind of the visual impact and also what you're saying, which is I think the main thing that you should focus on when you're making a poster really for that. Yeah.
Okay, so the poster's called Out of the Blue. It's relating to the change in Latino voters with relation to the US presidential election. It's considering the concept of change in three different ways. So it's looking at the Latino vote and considering it as a revolutionary change, an evolutionary change, or a punctuated evolutionary change. It considers the process of both Latino turnout and Latino allegiance, party allegiance, and the changes that it's taken over a period of time. So, seeing it as a revolution, as a revolutionary change, one might consider the recent election as being like a puncture, as a point of complete change. So, all of a sudden, the Latino vote has become so powerful that there's been almost a revolution within American politics. The evolutionary concept sees it more as a process of change. So over years, there's been an influx of immigrants who consider themselves Latino, and just a general dominance of the allegiance towards the Democrats. So, or alternatively, as a punctuated evolution, the punctuated evolution model sort of combines the two, but importantly recognises that certain points are more important than others. So you'll have an evolutionary process, but then all of a sudden something will happen that really changes the game. So we came to the conclusion that the recent election, this is like this October's US general election, was an example of a punctuated evolutionary change. Because over the period of time there's been a gradual upbuild in Latino influence, but this latest election it's been sort of, it's been seen most obviously.
Okay, well, the main point of our poster is, as you can tell from the title, it's a discussion of structure and agency within United States politics. And we've gone for the sort of four main branches of government and explained how they relate to the sort of structure and agency debate. So the Constitution, the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive being the office of the president. And slowly becoming less from a sort of structural viewpoint to more of a agential kind of power.
Yeah, and then just to further sort of illustrate the point, we decided to choose one case study. So we did the case of the Obamacare bill. So our timeline across the bottom here is just a demonstration of how the Obamacare bill progressed through Congress and how the structure and agency interacted within that process.
From a less positive standpoint, we also highlighted a few examples of how the Republican-led Congress have tried their best to sort of block a whole ton of bills, sort of relating to how it relates to how the Congress sort of is using their agential power to diminish the agential power of the administration.
In our poster, we've been looking at how structure and agency influences ethical behaviour within the press and the media generally. So we focus specifically on the royal family, as they've been quite culturally significant and have always been visible in the UK media up until the early 20th century. And so we focus specifically on the royal family, including the recent nude photos of Kate and Harry, and basically looked at how structural factors and agential factors affect how the media uses ethics in telling its stories.
Okay, so we did our poster on the structure versus agency arguments on the 2011 riots. We decided to try and break up the two arguments, the structure and the agency argument, and try and argue that it was either entirely structure or entirely agential. However, through the research and the argument, we decided that it was actually an interplay between the two, and that's what we've got to explain down here. We decided to visualise it through this picture in the centre, with the idea being that the structure creates borders and a containment zone for the agents to work within, and however it was the agents trying to break out against the structural constraints that they had.
This is our poster for political analysis. We looked at the Hillsborough cover-up and took structure and agency as our framework. The agency section, we took out two key actors in the cover-up, Sir Norman Bettison and Sir Ivan Patnick, and we looked at how their role was crucial. Then we went on to structure.
And we talked about the institution of the police, the criminal justice system and the government, and how these actually overridingly were important in the structure agency debate. And then our conclusion?
Our conclusion was that structure was the most important. However, to take away from the agency side of the aspect of the framework would be to remove the accountability, and thus it was important to acknowledge both sides of the argument.
So this is our poster. It's exploring the concept of power. We decided to do it on the power of press because we were interested in that section of the media. And in terms of power, we decided to concentrate on the second phase, which is the one that we all found most interesting and the one that, in our opinion, had the best literature on it.
We used these two case studies to illustrate it. The first one was on the EU and the Europe, and showed a Eurosceptic stance to show how the media would influence this in Britain. The second one was on the 2010 UK general election, and it showed how the newspapers clearly endorsed certain political parties and certain issues, such as the economy was a massive issue in 2010, to show how David Cameron was seen in the front of the Sun, was seen as the only hope, the only saviour to fix the economy. So that was prominent in this case study.
In our conclusion, we looked at the fact that it's impossible to really gauge people's perceptions, and there are a number of other intervening variables when you look at agenda setting in the press, such as people's personal attachments with issues.
It's just about how the Hillsborough disaster relates to the three phases of power: agenda setting, preference shaping, and the other one. What's the other one? Decision making. We just thought it was very interesting that it was topical at the time, and we could relate it into the police cover-up and how their decision making to change their stories affected people's perceptions of the disaster itself. And then we just related it to the three different phases of power, like preference shaping, the decision to change the stories, shape the preferences of the media, and that's how we came up with kind of copying the Sun's headline and this kind of layout.
Our poster's on the structure and agency in Obama's first term. Basically, we're making the point that both structure and agency has kind of impacted upon Obama and upon his first term. And you can't just say that one or the other is the dominant kind of force behind his behaviour or American behaviour and policy. And in this instance, we think structure has actually had a slightly more significant role in his first term because it's constrained or restricted some of its policies on Guantanamo Bay, immigration reform and healthcare reform. But that does not necessarily mean that structure is always more dominant, as it's kind of like this dialectical approach between the two and kind of interconnectedness.
So we've done our poster on structure and agency with Boris Johnson, and we use things like Boris bikes. Boris is the next Prime Minister to talk about how he doesn't really fit in with normal structures and how he uses his role as an agent to kind of get his own way and have a gentle impact on policy.
Nothing to say. Yeah, the whole theme was James Bond. We did a little confidential signs to make it look like a file.
Critics came off a bit.
Yeah, it's come off a bit, but we tried.
Okay, so our poster examines using the three faces of power, as it says in the title, why hasn't there been an invasion of North Korea? So, for example, we've had power as agenda setting, and we have explained how America has implemented their agenda on the whole situation. Decision making, we've spoken about China in particular, and in the UN Security Council. And we've done preference shaping, which was definitely the hardest one to pin down because you can't really tangibly measure preference shaping. The objective of the poster, as I said, was to find out why there hasn't been the invasion, and the conclusion we came to was that China, because of their influence both in the region and in global politics now, they just haven't, that they're going to veto anything, and North Korea is an ally of theirs. China has also pushed for economic liberalisation, which is another reason why there hasn't been an invasion, because such economic liberalisation is going to be beneficial not only to China but the rest of the world and America in particular.
Okay, our poster is about advertising women, so it's looking at the concept of power and the three faces of power, as well as Foucault, and how that applies to women's representation in advertising. So, for example, we've used these two case studies. This one, women are portrayed as a sexual object, and in this one, women are portrayed as only a domestic being. So, yeah.
This is our poster on preference shaping in women's magazines. We came up with the idea by thinking about what our mutual interests were, and it slowly built on that. We decided what we thought was the best topic within the module, and then decided how we could apply that best. We just designated tasks by thinking about just individually what we're most interested in, and then just saying, okay, well, I like this, I'll do this, and we built on from there. We got on really well as a group. We coordinated this quite well, and yeah, we were really happy with the result.
Well, we did the Julian Assange extradition case, and we did structure and agency, and then we've got these lines which show how everybody was connected, and then the broken link between the states and Ecuador. And we followed Colin Hayes' model here, and then sort of each stage of how structure and agency are interrelated is explained in everyone's according to each country.
Yeah, and we were looking primarily at the structural dominance of the United States over other countries in obviously Rick case.
So we thought we'd look at how identity and sport are interlinked, especially given the recent London 2012 Olympics, in which many of the athletes were mixed race or immigrants and performed outstandingly well. This is really important given that the Daily Mail ran a campaign based on the idea that many of our athletes plastic Brits or not. They weren't British enough. They were immigrants or from immigrant backgrounds. And so we looked in to see whether the Olympics had an effect on this, whether perhaps as a result of this success of immigrant background related athletes, perhaps immigration and multiculturalism was viewed in a more favourable light. Talking about the nationality as an ethnic basis, people who view it as a civic, the idea that you can be British even if you're a Jamaican immigrant. And there's people who see this civic identity as either traditionalist, I mean, to be British is to love cups of tea, London buses and the British Empire, or a more modern contemporary approach, the idea that, you know what, it's not about the past, it's about fitting in together. This diversity is actually an incredibly British phenomenon. And we use case studies, for example, the El Clasico matches in Spain to show how closely like sport and patriotism are intertwined. And also the World Cup in France '98 to show that it's quite clear that perhaps the success of a tournament in which multicultural racial styles perform well can actually shape how a country interprets itself. To conclude, that there was a poll afterwards that showed actually that about a third of the country now thought, hang on a second, maybe immigration is okay, maybe it's not necessarily a bad thing. Seeing people like Jessica Ennis and Mo Farah perform outstandingly. And we thought this was really interesting, the idea that perhaps this third of the country has moved from interpreting national identity and its traditional viewpoint to one of a more contemporary one where they acknowledge that you can be of a different race or religion and still be British, be a British sporting hero.
Our post is mainly about the Leveson inquiry and the inquiry into the phone hacking scandal at the News of the World. We look into the various theories into who may be responsible, and then look at the agent of Rebecca Brooks and make a judgment.
Okay, the first theory we looked at was the structuration theory, and relating that to the phone hacking scandal, we argued that all the individuals have the capability to alter and manipulate the sort of media structure, but by sort of changing the very rules and regulations, they themselves were sort of shaped by the structure itself, so sort of like a cyclical process. Okay, and the second one was critical realism.
Critical realism sees Rebecca Brooks as an agent, but with each decision that she makes, she shapes the structure, and the layers of structure in News Corp means that some decisions are easier to make than others. So ultimately, she's still responsible for her decisions.
The third theory is post-structuralism, which took a different tack to the other theories of structuration and critical realism, in that it's not itself a theory of structure and agency, but it's actually a theory of knowledge and power, and therefore uses a comprehensively different ontology reflecting yours, and it focuses on power and relationships between such an entity. The theory itself actually goes so far as to question how we even use the categories of structure and agency. All these things include knowledge, power, nexus, and discourse, and sites of power, are all very important to post-structuralism. The most prominent thing to highlight was the role of ontology, and how the differences between ontologies affected your own perspective of the scandal. And so we concluded that the inquiry was right to focus on the relationships between the press, public, police and politicians, rather than look at them individually, because the commonality between all three of the theories was itself the important relationship between structure and agency, and they couldn't be separated from one another.
Alright, so this is the case of successful indigenous resistance to the big interest of oil corporations in the world. In particular, we got interested by one case of Sarayaku tribe winning injunction in a court of Latin America, which dealt with the human rights. They won injunction, which forced Ecuadorian government to pay these people in the nation and allowed these people to preserve the right for their land. So basically what happened, they allowed to preserve their piece of jungle just for themselves without any oil exploratory activities by the big oil corporations. So basically this is a classic Goliath versus David struggle, and this time the David has prevailed. And we thought this is very interesting because it interplays with a film by David Cameron, Avatar, where people come into indigenous planets, they bring the corporation, they bring military, they bring military equipment, and they would stop at nothing, even genocide, to get the oil and get minerals out of land. And there have been a lot of cases in Amazon before where whole tribes got eradicated. It's basically genocide, all for the sake of oil. And we see how, in this case, human rights, current system of human rights around Latin America and in the world allow for successful resistance. So it's a classic agency versus structure case. And we thought it's just nice to interplay these two themes with Amazon and this stuff.
Hi there, this is our poster. We did the politicisation of human trafficking and looked at it from a perspective of change. We've got 4 main sections as well as an introduction and a findings. This is a descriptive section which just looks at some of the current government responses of the issue of human trafficking, followed up with a section which describes some of the issues and problems there are with the data. This bit looks at the concept of change and how the government response has changed, and finally we look at the politicisation of the issue and link it with change. And then our findings are here, quite simple, but there's limited data available. The lack of objective data shows that the government's response has been politicised, and yeah, that's pretty much our poster.
So we had a look at the rise of the Golden Dawn in Greece and contributing factors based on structure and agency and punctual evolution. But we didn't just focus on Greece. We decided to look Europe-wide as to why there's such a trend in the rise of far-right parties. We did a particular comparison with the Freedom Party of Austria. We tried to use some visuals to represent why there's been a rise and how this rise has come about.
This is our poster. It's about structure and agency and Scottish independence, and how the structure and the agency are interdependent on each other. So we have like economic structure, defence structure, historical and cultural structure, versus like agents like Margaret Thatcher, David Cameron and Alex Salmond.
Our poster is on the 3 faces of power, and obviously there are 3 faces here, and they all have power. It's basically who has power, in what context they have power.
So this is the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and we emphasise the focus on his decision-making power. And as a religious actor and a head of state. And then the second person who got the poster, Jill Abramson, she's more focused on the private sphere and the media and agenda setting power. And then the final guy we've got here is Subcomandante Marcos, who is a rebel leader and has a greater focus on
preference
shaping power, yes. Thought we'd keep it quite minimalistic. Time magazine covers, you know, it's big emphasis on power.
We looked at Stephen Lukes' 3 Faces of Power in the context of Jimmy Savile and what's happened in the last few months about what's come out about him. We looked at all 3 phases of Lukes' model, and we sought to see whether they fitted with explanations of how Jimmy Savile controlled his victims and controlled the organisations that he carried out abuse within. I think what we came up with was that in the end, whilst Lukes' model is very useful for explaining certain aspects of control and power, it could only give an incomplete explanation of why Jimmy Savile had done what he had done and how he had managed to control the organisations. The preference shaping idea, which is the most core part of Lukes' model, certainly elucidates how perhaps Jimmy Savile managed to abuse certain privileges and people that he was around him without perhaps them realising, and perhaps without the organisation realising or even questioning why he was doing anything. But in the end, we feel the second and third place of power between the agenda setting and preference shaping get rather confused, and it's not always the clearest model to explain just how Jimmy Savile carried out the actions and why. So we did feel that was, you know, a weakness, but perhaps we should have then moved on to see if there were other models which could better explain, but we didn't feel there were any models that could really explain it in a more complete way.
Okay, this is about racism in football and the three faces of power. The first face is that the FA can punish racist acts. The second is that certain items are put on and off the agenda. Importantly, black managers is not on the agenda, even though there are only 4 of them. And the third face is about shaping preferences.
It's a positive portrayal of how power can be used to shape things around within a society. Racism being seen as a bad thing that a society can have a bad hobby for some people or a bad attitude could be altered within different settings by different ways that we've sort of used football as one example and show that people can enforce, then the agencies can put the issue on the agenda in quite a few different ways, and people again, FA, can again support that, and at the end how the wider programs within the society can again reinforce some of these good attitudes to take place.
And racism in football has been greatly reduced, but there's still a long way to go.